You think you know your life. You wake up, make your coffee, go through the motions, and tell yourself that this quiet, predictable existence is enough. I thought the same. Then came him. Before we get into the details, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. It was early autumn when Daniel Carter moved in next door. The sky was a watercolor mix of burnt orange and soft pink when the moving truck rumbled up the quiet street. I watched from my kitchen window, half hidden behind the curtain, as a man stepped out of the driver's seat. Tall, rugged, the kind of man whose presence demanded attention. There was something about the way he moved, confident, effortless, like he had nothing to lose. I should have looked away, but I didn't. Our first conversation wasn't anything special. A simple knock at my door. A polite introduction. Claire Evans. His voice was smooth, like aged whiskey. I nodded, gripping the edge of the doorframe. I'm Daniel. Just moved in. A slow smile tugged at his lips. Figured I should say hello. I hesitated. Too long. And in that silence, something shifted. Something unspoken crackled between us, invisible but undeniable. From that moment on, he was everywhere. At the grocery store, on my morning walks, a casual wave across the lawn, a knowing smirk as he leaned against his porch railing, cigarette smoke curling in the cool air. It started small, brief conversations, harmless flirtation. Then came the touches. A hand at the small of my back. His fingers grazing my wrist, lingering just a second too long. I told myself it meant nothing. Elite. Emily, his sister. Or so he said. She was delicate, with eyes that held too many ghosts. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was like shattered glass, soft, but cutting. She's going through a messy divorce, Daniel told me one evening. She needs space. A fresh start. I understood that. I'd lost my husband, Richard, 5 years ago. Grief was a heavy thing. So when Daniel asked if I could spend some time with Emily, I agreed. She was quiet at first, reserved. But as the days passed, she began to trust me. And then one night, she whispered something that froze my blood. Claire, be careful. I frowned. Careful. She looked away, out into the darkness. Daniel isn't who you think he is. I should have listened. Instead, I let him kiss me. It happened fast. His hands tangling in my hair, my body arching into him, the sharp intake of breath when our lips met. It was fire. It was hunger. It was a mistake. Because the next morning, I found the letter, tucked between the pages of a book Emily had left behind. 5 words, scrawled in frantic handwriting. He did this to me too. The letter sat in my hands, the ink slightly smudged, as if written in a hurry, or in fear. I read it again, then again. My heart pounded in my ears, but I refused to let panic take hold. This had to be a misunderstanding. Had to be. But when I looked up, Emily was watching me from the porch next door. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stared. And suddenly I knew. Something was very, very wrong. I spent the next few days in a fog, replaying every moment I had shared with Daniel. Every touch, every lingering glance, every whispered promise. Had I been just another pawn in whatever game he was playing? I needed answers. And there was only one person who could give them to me. That night, I invited Daniel over for dinner. I poured him a glass of wine, watched as he leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. I forced a smile. Tell me more about Emily. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before his mask slipped back into place. What do you want to know? She told me something strange, I said, swirling my wine. That I should be careful. He chuckled, shaking his head. Emily's been through a lot. She doesn't trust people easily. I tilted my head. Why not? Another pause. Then, the lie. She had a bad marriage. His voice was smooth, practiced. Her ex was abusive. Controlling. He destroyed her life. I wanted to believe him. But I couldn't, because I had already done what I should have done from the start. I had researched him, and what I found, it made my blood run cold. That night, after Daniel left, I sat in the dim glow of my laptop screen, my fingers trembling as I typed his name into the search bar. I didn't expect to find much. Maybe an old LinkedIn profile, some scraps of information. But what I found, it made my stomach twist into knots. Daniel Carter wasn't just a man with a complicated past. He was a ghost. No birth records. No social media footprint. No trace of him before 5 years ago. It was as if he had never existed. And then I found the article. The headline hit me like a punch to the gut. Missing woman presumed dead. Husband vanishes without a trace. The picture beneath it? A woman with bright blue eyes and a soft smile. Emily. The man beside her? Daniel. Only his name wasn't Daniel Carter back then. It was James Holloway. My breath caught in my throat. I scanned the article, my pulse hammering. Emily Holloway had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Her husband had drained their joint bank accounts and fled town the next day. No one had seen him since. Until now. Until me. The next morning, I confronted Emily. I know who he is, I said, gripping the edge of my porch railing so hard my knuckles turned white. I know what he did to you. Her face went pale. Claire, you don't understand. I understand plenty. My voice was shaking. You wrote that letter. You wanted me to find it. Tears welled in her eyes. She glanced toward Daniel's house, lowering her voice to a whisper. He'll kill us if he knows. A chill ran down my spine, because in that moment I believed her. Emily's words stayed with me long after she left. He'll kill us if he knows. I had two choices. I could pack my bags, run, pretend none of this ever happened. Or I could fight. And something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years, chose to fight. That evening, I saw Daniel outside, tending to his garden, completely at ease. He had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down. Hey, stranger. His voice was smooth as ever when I walked up. Miss me already? I forced a smile, play my part. Actually, I was hoping you'd come over for dinner again. I made something special. His grin widened. You sure know how to make a guy feel lucky. He had no idea how unlucky he really was. I spent the next few hours preparing everything. The meal, the wine, the trap. Emily was waiting at her house, ready to act when the moment was right. All we needed was one mistake from Daniel. Just one. He arrived right on time, stepping inside like he owned the place. His eyes roamed the room, and for the first time, I noticed something. He was studying it, checking exits, sizing up his surroundings. I pushed down the wave of nausea. He wasn't just dangerous. He was calculating. But so was I. Dinner was set. Candles flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The wine glowed deep red in our glasses. I kept my breathing even, my hands steady. Daniel sat across from me, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. Watching. Assessing. You look tense, he said, swirling his wine. Something on your mind? I forced a laugh, light and airy. Just a long day. He smirked. I know the feeling. I watched him take a sip. My pulse pounded. He had no idea. Emily was waiting next door, phone in hand. If I could just get Daniel to talk, to admit something, she would record everything. But Daniel wasn't a fool. He was too careful. I had to push him, make him slip. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Tell me something, Daniel. Why did you really come here? He tilted his head, amused. I told you. Fresh start. New beginnings. I shook my head. No. I mean before that. Before Emily. Before me. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. I had hit a nerve. You're digging in places you shouldn't, he murmured. I held my ground. Emily wasn't your sister, was she? Silence. Then the smile vanished. He set his glass down carefully, the sound too loud in the quiet room. For the first time since I met him, Daniel Carter, James Holloway, stopped pretending. You really want to know?
His voice was softer now.
Dangerous. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But it was too late for that. I held my breath. Daniel, James, leaned back in his chair, studying me with something between amusement and menace. You really want to know who I am? He murmured. I didn't answer. My silence was enough. He chuckled, shaking his head. You know, I was going to take my time with you, Claire. Really ease you into it. But you're too damn smart for your own good. Cold fear slithered down my spine. Ease me into what? I forced myself to ask. His smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. Trust. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the deep red liquid dance under the candlelight. That's the real game, isn't it? Making people trust you. Once they do, you can do anything to them. And they'll let you. I gripped the table, my nails digging into the wood. How many? My voice was barely a whisper. His eyes gleamed. He knew what I was asking. How many women have you done this to? For a moment, he just watched me. Then, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. How many times have you fallen asleep at night, Claire? He asked. Thinking you were safe? I swallowed. How many times have you woken up? He continued, his voice soft, hypnotic, never realizing someone was standing outside your window. Watching. Waiting. My blood ran ice cold. I tried to keep my face still, but I knew he saw it. The fear. And he liked it. I had overplayed my hand. I wasn't setting a trap for him anymore. He had set one for me. Emily was next door. She had to have heard everything. Had she called the police? I had to stall. Had to keep him talking. So I reached for my wine glass, forced my hand to stop shaking, and smiled. You really think you're in control here, don't you?
I said.
Daniel, James, tilted his head. I don't think, Claire. I know. And then,
crash.
The front door slammed open. Emily stood there, breathless, a phone in her shaking hand. And, behind her, 2 police officers stepped inside, guns drawn. Daniel's face went blank. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control anymore. For a moment, nobody moved. The air was thick with something electric, something raw. The kind of tension that comes right before a storm, before lightning strikes. Daniel's eyes flicked between me, Emily, and the 2 officers standing in the doorway. Then he smiled.
Slow.
Calculated. I suppose this is the part where you tell me I'm under arrest? His voice was smooth as silk. Unbothered. One of the officers, Detective Harris, according to his badge, stepped forward, gun steady. James Holloway, you're wanted for questioning in the disappearance of Emily Holloway and the suspected fraud of... Whoa, whoa, whoa. Daniel, James, raised his hands lazily. Suspected? That hurts, Detective. I thought by now you'd have more proof than that. His voice was mocking, dripping with arrogance. Detective Harris's jaw tightened. You can explain yourself down at the station. Daniel turned back to me then, ignoring the gun pointed at his chest. Was it good for you, Claire? He asked, tilting his head. The game? I forced myself to meet his gaze, ignoring the way my stomach twisted. I'm not playing anymore. His smile widened. Oh, sweetheart. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You think this is the end? The words slithered into the air like poison. A chill ran down my spine. Then, in one swift motion, he moved. I didn't even have time to process what was happening before he lunged for the knife on the table.
Bang!
The gunshot roared through the house. Daniel collapsed onto the floor, his body twisting as he clutched his shoulder, screaming. The room exploded into chaos. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The officers rushed forward, pinning Daniel to the ground, shouting commands. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the blood pooling on my hardwood floors. It was over. Or was it? The room was a blur of movement. Officers shouting, Emily sobbing, the sharp metallic scent of blood thick in the air. But all I could hear was his laughter. Daniel, James, was on the floor, his shoulder bleeding, his face twisted in pain. But through it all, he was laughing.
Slow.
Raspy. Like a man who still thought he had the upper hand. Detective Harris pressed a knee into his back, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. You think this is funny? Daniel turned his head just enough to look at me. His smile was eerie, almost proud. I told you, he murmured. This isn't over. Something cold crawled down my spine. Because I believed him. They dragged him out of my house, his boots smearing blood across my floor. Emily was shaking beside me, her fingers clutching the edges of her sweater like they were the only thing keeping her upright. He's gone, I whispered, though my voice felt far away. It's over. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Because men like Daniel, they don't just disappear. They wait. They plot. And then they come back. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. Emily stayed with me, too afraid to go back to her house. She barely spoke. I barely slept. I told myself it was paranoia, that the way I checked the locks 3 times before bed, the way my skin crawled every time the phone rang, was just leftover fear. But then the first letter came. No return address.
No signature.
Just a single sentence scrawled in perfect, elegant handwriting. You think this is over? My hands shook as I read it. I stepped outside, scanning the street, the houses, the trees. There was no one, but I could feel him. Watching. Waiting. And suddenly I knew this was just the beginning. The letter sat on my kitchen table for hours. I didn't touch it. Didn't move it. Just stared. Emily hovered nearby, her arms wrapped around herself. What does it mean? She whispered. I swallowed hard. We both knew what it meant. Daniel, James, wasn't finished. The question was, how far would he go? The police brushed it off. Could be a prank, Detective Harris said, barely looking at the letter as he bagged it for evidence. People in town know what happened. Some sicko might just be messing with you. I didn't believe that. Not for a second. I saw it in his eyes. In the way he tried to keep his expression neutral, the way his fingers flexed when he held the paper. He knew it was him, but he didn't know where Daniel was. And that terrified me more than anything. A week passed. Then 2. And just when I started to convince myself it really was over, the photos arrived. They were slipped under my front door, in the dead of night. No envelope. No note. Just a stack of glossy, high-definition pictures.
Pictures of me.
In the grocery store. Walking my dog. Standing on my porch, looking over my shoulder. The last one made my stomach drop. It was me, sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the first letter. Taken from outside my window. My breath hitched. Emily grabbed the photos from my hands, her face turning pale. Claire, I couldn't speak. Because I finally understood. Daniel wasn't just watching. He was here. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, my heart pounding at every creak of the house. Emily dozed off on the couch, exhaustion finally overtaking her. But I couldn't close my eyes. Because if I did, what if I woke up to him standing over me? The photos replayed in my mind like a horror film.
How close had he been?
How long had he watched? And worst of all, what was he waiting for? Sometime past 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound.
Top, top, top.
It came from outside. From my porch. I gripped the arms of my chair, my pulse hammering in my throat. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Then a voice.
Low.
Smooth.
Familiar.
Claire. My breath caught. He was here. I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else as I crept toward the front door. Emily stirred on the couch, but I didn't wake her. I reached for the curtain, my fingers trembling, and pulled it back just an inch. The porch was empty, but on the wooden railing, scrawled in something dark and glistening, were 3 words. Sweet dreams, Claire. I staggered back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. Because whatever he had written it with, it wasn't ink. The room was suffocating. The walls seemed closer than before, the air too thick to breathe. I could still see the words, dark and glistening on my porch railing. Sweet dreams, Claire. My fingers shook as I locked the door, double-checking it, then triple-checking. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, none of them with answers I wanted. Had he been here for hours? Had he stood in the dark, just waiting for me to notice? Had he been inside? Emily stirred on the couch. What's wrong? Her voice was groggy, thick with sleep, but the second she saw my face, she sat up. Claire? I turned to her, my throat tight. He was here. The words landed like a slap. Her breath hitched. What? I pointed toward the porch, unable to bring myself to say it again. She hesitated for only a second before jumping to her feet and rushing to the window. She yanked back the curtain and gasped. Oh my God. The way she said it, soft, disbelieving, made the hairs on my arms rise. She whirled to me, her face pale. Call the police. I shook my head. And tell them what? That he left another note? That I think... My voice cracked. That I think he was standing here? Emily's hands curled into fists. They already know what he is. Maybe this is enough too. No, it's not. I swallowed hard. Because he didn't break in. He didn't touch me. They'll just tell me to keep my doors locked and be careful. The truth settled between us, thick with dread. Daniel, James, knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing with me. And he was winning. The next morning, I drove Emily to a motel on the edge of town. I don't want to leave you alone, she said, her voice tight. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. You're not safe in my house. You're not safe either. I didn't argue, because she was right, but I needed her away. If he came back, I needed to know that at least one of us wasn't within arm's reach. As I pulled into the motel parking lot, she turned to me. Come with me. I shook my head. I can't. She reached for my hand, squeezing tight. Then promise me something. Anything. She hesitated. Then, don't go back to your house. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. She knew me too well. She knew I would go back. The house was too quiet without Emily. The silence stretched long and thin, pressing against me like an unseen weight. I kept the curtains drawn, every light on, my phone in my hand. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my reflection in the dark window. Waiting. For what? I didn't know. Or maybe I did. Maybe I was waiting for him. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up. A text from an unknown number. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Why aren't you sleeping? I dropped the phone, my breath catching. The air vanished from my lungs. My vision blurred. He was watching.
Right now.
I shot up from my chair, racing to the windows, ripping the curtains back. Nothing. The yard was empty. The street was still. But I felt him.
Close.
Too close. I grabbed my keys and ran. I drove without direction, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The streetlights flickered past in a blur, my heartbeat a hammer in my chest. I couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Not when he hadn't touched me. Not when I didn't have proof. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to stop. Not until I made it stop. I pulled into the only place that made sense. Detective Harris's house. I didn't know him well, only from the investigation. But he had been the only one to take me seriously. I rang the doorbell, my pulse pounding. The door opened, and Harris stood there, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes red from sleep. Claire? I swallowed. He's watching me. His expression hardened. Come inside. His house was nothing like I expected.
Simple.
Almost empty. The home of a man who spent more time working than living. He poured me a drink. Tell me everything. I did. The photos. The letter. The text message. The feeling of being watched. He listened, silent, his jaw tight. When I finished, he leaned back, running a hand through his hair. This isn't just stalking. I clenched my fists. I know.
He sighed.
I'll put a patrol on your street. We'll. No, I shook my head. That won't stop him. Harris studied me. What do you want to do, Claire? I swallowed hard. I want to end this. Silence. Then, okay. We made a plan. It was dangerous. Maybe even stupid. But it was the only way. We had to bait him. We had to make Daniel think he had won. And then we would take him down. For good. That night, I drove back home. I left my door unlocked. I turned off the lights. I got into bed. And I waited. Because I knew him now. I knew what he wanted. And I was going to give it to him. I lay in bed, my body stiff, my ears straining to hear beyond the silence. Every creak of the house, every distant car passing on the street, every gust of wind brushing against the windows, it all felt too loud. I wasn't alone. I could feel him. The hours crawled. My breathing was slow, measured, but my heart pounded like a drum against my ribs. Then, a soft creak. The unmistakable sound of a footstep just outside my bedroom door. I gripped the knife under my pillow, my fingers slick with sweat.
Not yet.
Another step. And then the doorknob turned. A slow, deliberate movement. He wasn't rushing. He wanted me to know that this was real, that this was happening, that I was his. The door eased open. The hallway light spilled into my room, stretching a shadow across the floor. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I wanted him inside. I needed him close. For the plan to work, he had to think I was weak, that I was afraid, that he had already won. His silhouette loomed in the doorway, a dark, unstoppable force. Claire, he murmured. That voice.
Smooth.
Almost gentle, like a lover's whisper in the dark. I felt something cold press against my throat. A knife. His knife. Don't scream, he warned. I didn't. Instead, I exhaled slowly and smiled. The moment of confusion flickered across his face. I felt it in the slight shift of his grip, the hesitation in his stance. Then, before he could react, the lights exploded on.
Boom.
The bedroom door slammed open, and Harris and two other officers rushed in. Daniel jerked back, his knife slicing across my skin as he stumbled away. Blood welled at my throat, hot and wet, but I didn't feel it, because all I saw was his face. The way his eyes widened in pure, animalistic rage. The way he realized he had been trapped. No, he growled.
No, no, no.
Down on the ground now. Harris barked, his gun trained on him. Daniel moved fast, but Harris was faster.
Bang!
A gunshot rang out, a deafening, brutal sound, and Daniel's body crashed against the floor. Blood spread across the hardwood. I gasped, pressing a hand to my bleeding neck, my vision blurring. Daniel groaned, his body writhing, but he wasn't dead. Not yet. Harris was on him in an instant, pinning him down, snapping the handcuffs tight. It was over. Finally over. Or so I thought. Because when I met Daniel's gaze one last time, his lips curled into a bloody grin. And he whispered, "This isn't the end." I woke up in the hospital. The wound on my neck had been stitched, the pain a dull, distant thing. Emily was there, gripping my hand, her eyes red-rimmed. "He's gone," she whispered. "They took him away." I closed my eyes. But I didn't feel relief. Because I knew the truth. Men like Daniel don't disappear. They wait. They plot. And when the time is right, they come back. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of sterile hospital rooms, police reports, endless questioning. 2 weeks of looking over my shoulder, feeling his voice slither through my mind like smoke. Daniel was locked up. They had him on breaking and entering, attempted murder, stalking, fraud, the list went on. Detective Harris assured me that he wasn't getting out anytime soon. But I knew better. Men like Daniel didn't just sit in a cell and rot. They waited. And when the time was right, they struck. Emily and I moved into a hotel. Neither of us could stomach going back to the house. Too many ghosts. Too many nights waking up thinking I heard him whisper my name. Harris called me 3 times a day, checking in. Officers patrolled the hotel parking lot. I carried a gun now, something I swore I'd never do. But fear does that to you. It turns you into someone else. I wasn't the same Claire Evans who had smiled at Daniel Carter from across the lawn, who had blushed when his fingers brushed mine. That Claire was dead. The nightmares didn't stop. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, his face behind my eyelids, his breath hot against my ear.
This isn't the end.
I'd jolt awake, reaching for the gun on the nightstand, aiming into the dark. But he was never there. Emily didn't sleep much either. One night, she knocked on my door, her voice barely above a whisper. I had a dream, she said, her eyes hollow. That he came back. I swallowed hard. He won't. She didn't answer, because we both knew it was a lie. Then, on the 14th day, Harris called. I knew something was wrong the second I heard his voice. Claire, he said, his tone clipped. We need to talk. My grip tightened on the phone. What happened? A long silence. Then, Daniel escaped. The world tilted. Everything went cold. My mouth went dry. What? He was being transported to a higher security facility. The van went off the road. When officers got to the crash site, the guards were unconscious. I could barely hear him over the roaring in my head. The back doors were open. Harris's voice lowered. Daniel was gone. My vision blurred. My pulse thundered in my ears.
No. No, no, no.
This wasn't happening. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. When? My voice shook. 5 hours ago.
5 hours.
I felt like I was going to be sick. Claire, Harris said urgently, we've got officers covering every major exit out of the state. We'll find him. But I barely heard him, because I already knew. Daniel wasn't leaving. He wasn't running. He was coming back. For me. For Emily. For revenge. I hung up and moved fast. Threw what little I had into a bag. Grabbed my gun. My keys. Emily met my gaze, reading the fear in my eyes. He's free, isn't he? I nodded. Her breath hitched. What do we do? She whispered. I looked at the door. At the shadows beyond it. Then back at her. We finish this. We drove fast, too fast, the tires screeching as we left the hotel behind. I didn't know where we were going at first, only that we couldn't stay. Not when he was out there. Emily sat rigid in the passenger seat, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling in her lap. He's coming for us, she whispered. I tightened my grip on the wheel. I know. Then why are we running? I looked at her. We're not. Her brow furrowed. Then, realization dawned in her eyes. We weren't running. We were hunting. Detective Harris didn't like the plan. Claire, you need to stay hidden, he said over the phone. We're working on tracking him. Don't make this worse. But I was done hiding. Daniel had spent too long controlling me, haunting me. Now it was my turn. Tell me where the crash happened, I demanded. Harris hesitated. Claire, tell me. A long pause. Then a sigh. Near the old gas station on Route 17. I ended the call. Turned the car in that direction. Emily was silent beside me, but I could feel her fear, her anger, her readiness. Are we really doing this? She murmured. I looked at her. Yes. The gas station was abandoned, its windows shattered, its roof caving in. The perfect place for a ghost to disappear. And Daniel was a ghost. But not to me. I knew him. Knew how he thought. Knew that he was watching. Emily and I stepped out of the car, my gun heavy in my hand. The wind howled through the empty lot. Then a sound.
Soft.
Deliberate. A slow clap. I turned just in time to see him step out from behind a rusted truck, his face half hidden in the shadows. Daniel.
Alive. Whole.
Smiling. Claire, he drawled. I knew you'd come. The way he said it, so sure of himself, infuriated me. Hands up, I snapped, raising my gun. It's over. But he didn't move, didn't flinch, just grinned. You don't want to shoot me. His voice was silk. Not yet. Emily stiffened beside me. I could hear her breathing, fast, uneven. Daniel's eyes flicked to her. Hey, sweetheart. He smiled wider. I bet you missed me. Emily trembled. I kept my gun steady. Shut up.
He laughed. Laughed.
God, you two really are something. He tilted his head. You thought you could outsmart me? I clicked off the safety. I don't think. A beat of silence. Then his smile faded. His hands slowly went up. And for the first time, I saw something new in his eyes.
Doubt.
Because he realized I wasn't bluffing. You won't do it, he said, quieter now. You're not like me. I stepped closer. My heart pounded, my hands steady. You're right, I murmured. I'm worse. And then I pulled the trigger. The shot ripped through the night. Daniel jerked, his body twisting as he hit the ground. His hands flew to his leg, blood pooling fast beneath him. He screamed. I stood over him, the gun still raised. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling from the shock. For the first time, Daniel Holloway looked afraid. Emily stepped beside me, her hands curled into fists. She stared down at the man who had ruined her life. Then she kicked him in the ribs.
Hard.
Daniel choked on a laugh, blood dripping from his lips. You really did it, he gasped. I looked at him, my chest rising and falling.
Yeah.
I did. The police came minutes later. Harris stormed toward me, eyes blazing.
Jesus, Claire.
I didn't look away from Daniel as they dragged him up, slapped handcuffs onto his bloody wrists. Are you mad? I asked. Harris exhaled.
No.
Daniel lifted his head, his face pale but still smiling. He locked eyes with me, something dark and knowing twisting in his gaze. This isn't the end, he whispered. And maybe in his mind it wasn't. Maybe in some sick way, he thought he'd get another chance. But he wouldn't. Because as the police shoved him into the back of a squad car, I finally understood. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about taking back control. And I had. Finally, after everything, I was free. Should Claire have found a new man to live on, or is it better to remain faithful, but without a man in the house? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss if this story resonated with you. Support the channel, like, subscribe, and click the bell to not miss new releases. Let's talk together about things that really matter.